Okay, this is I Survived the Sinking of the Titanic, chapters 3 and 4. George didn't mean to get into trouble. It's just that he got these great ideas, like on their first day at sea, when he had climbed up the huge ladder into the crow's nest. "Aunt Daisy," he yelled, waving his arms. She had looked up, and she'd almost fainted. And yesterday, George had explored the entire ship. Aunt Daisy kept warning him that he'd get lost. She said the ship was like a maze, but George could always find his way, even in the huge forest that stretched out behind their farm. Mama used to say that George had a map of the world behind his eyes. He saw the engine rooms and the boiler rooms and wound up on the third-class recreation deck. He was watching some boys play marbles when he noticed that he wasn't alone. A little boy was staring up at him with huge eyes the color of amber glass. "See," the boy said, "see." And he held out a postcard of the Statue of Liberty. He looked so proud, like he'd carved that big lady himself. George felt like he had to show something in return, so he took out his good luck charm, the Bowie knife Papa had given him for his 9th birthday. He let the little boy run his fingers across the handle, which was carved from an elk's antler. "Enzo," the little boy said, puffing out his chest and pointing to himself. "George," said George. "Giorgio," the little boy cried with a smile. A man sitting near them laughed. He was reading an Italian-English dictionary and had the same huge eyes as the boy. George guessed right that he was Enzo's father. "Marco," he said, shaking George's hand, "you are our first American friend." Marco must have been studying that dictionary pretty hard because George understood everything he said. George learned that Enzo was 4 years old. He'd lost his mama, too. He and Marco came from a little town in Italy, and now they were moving to New York City. George told Marco about their farm and their trip and explained that any decent person living in New York had to be a Giants fan. For some reason, Marco thought that was funny. When it was time for George to leave, Enzo got upset, very upset. "Giorgio," he howled, loud enough for the entire ship to hear. People stared and put their hands over their ears. Marco promised that they'd see George again, but Enzo wouldn't quit howling. George had never heard anything so loud. By the time Enzo let go of George's leg and George ran back up to the suite, Aunt Daisy was practically howling too. "I thought he fell overboard," she cried. But even then, she wasn't really mad. She didn't get really mad until last night. How that lady screamed when George came sliding down the banister like he really was a giant squid. George didn't mind getting yelled at. He was used to it. Not a day at school went by without Mr. Landers shouting, "George, settle down!" And Papa, well, he always seemed to be mad at George. But not Aunt Daisy, and being on this trip was supposed to make her happy for the first time since her husband died last year. It had been Uncle Cliff's dream to be on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. He'd struck it rich selling automobiles and had plenty of money to pay for one of the biggest suites on the ship. When Uncle Cliff had his accident, George was sure Aunt Daisy would cancel the trip. Instead, she'd invited George and Phoebe to go with her. And to George's shock, Papa said they could. "Your aunt's going on this trip to find a little peace," he said to George. "I expect you to be a perfect gentleman." And if he wasn't, George knew he'd be shipped off to that army school for sure. Papa had been talking about that place ever since George had brought the 2-foot rat snake to school to show Mr. Landers, because they were studying reptiles. George had been perfect the whole time in England. He'd let Aunt Daisy drag him to a fancy clothes store for a new pair of boots. He'd even learned to drink tea without spitting it back into the cup. But, well, the Titanic. The ship gave him so many great ideas, but now he'd really be perfect. No more ideas for the rest of the voyage. Chapter 4. Phoebe wasn't taking any chances with George. "I'm not letting you out of my sight," she announced after they finished breakfast. "I'm your guardian angel." "I didn't know angels wore spectacles," he said, tugging on one of Phoebe's curls. "The smart ones do," Phoebe said, grabbing George's arm. She offered him a lemon drop from the little silver tin she'd been carrying around since London. George made a face. He hated those old lady candies. George wanted to go find Marco and Enzo and hear more about Italy. He wanted to ride the elevators up and down. Hardly any other ship in the world had elevators. Better yet, he wanted to find Mr. Andrews, the ship's designer. When Mr. Andrews had stopped by their table at dinner the first night, George thought he was just another boring millionaire coming over to kiss Aunt Daisy's hand. But Mr. Andrews was different. "You built the Titanic?" said George. Mr. Andrews smiled. "Not by myself. It took thousands of men to build her. But I did design her, that's true." He invited George and Phoebe to come with him to the first-class writing room. He unrolled the ship's blueprints across a long polished table. It was like looking at the skeleton of a giant beast. "She's the biggest moving object ever built," Mr. Andrews explained. 11 stories tall, 45,000 tons of steel, and longer than 4 city blocks. "Our aunt says nothing bad can happen to this ship," Phoebe said. "People say it's unsinkable." "No ship is safer," Mr. Andrews said. "That is certainly true." "What if the Titanic was hit by a meteor?" said Phoebe, whose latest obsession was outer space. She was determined to see a shooting star before they docked in New York. Mr. Andrews didn't laugh or roll his eyes like Mr. Landers did when Phoebe asked her questions. "I hadn't planned on any meteors hitting the ship," Mr. Andrews said thoughtfully, "but I'd like to think she could take almost anything and still float." Phoebe seemed satisfied. "Are there any secret passages?" said George. Mr. Andrews studied his blueprints and then pointed to the boiler room. There are escape ladders," he said. "They run up the starboard side of the ship, up 2 decks, through the stokers' quarters, and into their dining hall. I heard the crew likes using them instead of the stairs." George could have stayed there all night. He asked a million questions, and Mr. Andrews answered every single one. "I was like you when I was a boy," Mr. Andrews said just before Aunt Daisy came to haul George off to bed. "One day I predict you'll build a ship of your own." George knew that would never happen. He could barely get through a day at school, but he liked that Mr. Andrews said it, and he sure wanted to find those secret ladders. But Phoebe had different ideas. First, she dragged George to the first-class library so she could check out a book on Halley's Comet. Then she took him on a walk on the boat deck. He felt like a dog. "Strange," Phoebe said, looking at the lifeboats that hung just off the deck. "There are only 16 boats. That's not nearly enough for everyone." "The ship's unsinkable," George said. "So do we really need lifeboats at all?" Phoebe stared at the boats and shrugged. "I guess you're right," she said. And then she announced that it was time to see how many ladies were wearing hats with blue feathers. George groaned. This would be the most boring day of his life. But at least nobody was yelling at him.